On her map, a story from the Saltscar universe.
Chapter 2. Kay left the gap deliberate. She'd pinned her composite charts to the flat rock with iron survey pins at each corner, lantern flame bending in the ridge wind, and where the Bureau's 40-year regression tables should have anchored the western margin, she'd left bare stone. An invitation shaped like an absence. Vess came with his transit case at dusk. He didn't sit. He stood across the rock table and opened the case with both hands, and the leather creaked in the silence like a knot-taking strain. He laid the first page down, Bureau Coastal Regression, Hershey Watermark, Standardized Grid, and waited. She set Station 1 beside it, her father's octopus gall ink against the Bureau's pressed graphite. He laid the second page. She matched it. Station 2. Wind moved the lantern. Paper shifted. Neither spoke. The game had no name and no rules except the ones they were writing with each placement. His projections calibrated to uniform substrate density and orbital tide models, hers to iron pins that wouldn't grip and basalt that crumbled like chalk. His numbers said 15 years. Hers said 4. He looked at the gap between the figures the way a man looks at a wound he recognizes but hasn't been asked to treat. He didn't argue. He set a third page beside the first two. Not a regression model. A Bureau memo, internal header, no distribution list, referencing anomalous substrate signatures at stations 3, 4, and 6. Flagged for follow-up. The follow-up column was empty. She reached for it. His fingers stayed on the corner. 1 beat, 2. The lantern threw his hand's shadow across the memo's text. Who flagged the anomalies? The memo doesn't name the analyst. The memo was right there. She could read it herself. The header, the station numbers, the empty follow-up column that said someone inside the Bureau had seen what she'd seen and been silenced or ignored. She watched his fingers instead. Lyra pinned the composite chart to the basalt table with both palms. 6 faces around the oval. 3 elders, 2 terrace overseers, Peller in the harbor seat he'd inherited from a dead man. The chamber doors were shut, the windows latched against a wind that carried salt and the faint sulfur smell of exposed rock. 2 oil lamps. No clerk. Lyra had dismissed the clerk. My daughter's preliminary findings. She traced the curve with 1 finger, the exponential line that began where her own 3-season estimate ended and kept climbing. Undercutting at stations 3, 4, and 6 exceeds anything in the surface profiles. The substrate is failing from below. Torath's bench groaned as he shifted. His jaw worked once, twice. What does the Hershey assessor's data show? I haven't seen his numbers. Silence. The kind that pooled like rainwater in a crack, finding every fault. The elder to Torath's left, Sarah, who'd held her seat since before Kay was born, set her hands flat on the table. Then why is he here, Lyra? Lyra didn't answer the question. She reached into the fold of her council wrap and produced a single page, creased from 6 weeks pressed beneath a clay bread crock, the candle wax she'd used to reseal it, still visible along one edge. She laid it face up at the center of the basalt oval. The Hershey watermark caught lamplight. Diplomatic seal. No signature. Preliminary relocation terms. Island of Mara. Guaranteed port allocation. Skilled labor placement. Provisional housing for 400 families. Cultural preservation allowances. The room went quiet in the way that Maran rooms go quiet when a word has been broken. Not silence, but withdrawal. Every breath pulled inward, held behind teeth. Torath reached across the table and pushed the page back toward Lyra with 2 fingers. He did not read it. He did not need to. The watermark said enough. Lyra left the page where it stopped, centered on the basalt between them like a stone neither could lift. She folded her hands. She waited. Everyone in the room knew it would still be there tomorrow. The pen nib split on the second stroke of 12. Vess lifted it, examined the damage, a hairline fracture running the length of the brass tip, ink pooling in the crack like blood in a wound. He'd pressed too hard. The Bureau's 15-year figure sat crossed out above, a single clean line through it that he'd drawn without hesitation. 12 sat below, wet and bleeding at the edges where the split nib had dragged. He knew the number was a lie. A smaller lie than 15. A lie nonetheless. The carbon sheet beneath had captured both figures. He peeled it back, checked the impression. The crossout showed. 12 showed. On Pelos he'd written 9 years and the Bureau had printed 7. On Vath 11, they'd printed 9. The machine rounded down or up depending on what Hirsch needed the island to be worth. He'd learned not to count the gap. He stood, crossed to the window. The harbor held 4 vessels, 2 Marin fishing boats, a coastal trader with Hershey registration, and the weekly packet just nosing past the breakwater, its pennant limp in the dead air. Half the mooring posts stood empty, ropes coiled on dry wood. A harbor this size should hold 12 boats minimum. He'd noted that in the unlogged file, too. The harbormaster's boy brought the pouch 20 minutes after the packet docked. Vess broke the seal with his thumb. 1 sheet. Corin's hand, the precise, unhurried script of a man who had never visited the islands he scheduled for death. Preliminary by end of week. Viability determination only. Do not recommend further study. The last sentence was underlined. Twice. He'd received this language on Pelos, on Veth, on Sidon and Korak. 4 islands, 4 directives. 4 times he'd uncapped the pen and written what the template required. 4 islands he could no longer name without tasting copper. He set Corin's directive beside the template. The locked case sat on the adjacent desk. Kay's acceleration curve, her father's figures, the substrate anomalies the Bureau had flagged and then abandoned, everything that made 12 a lie and 4 the truth. The pen was in his hand. The carbon sheet weighted beneath the template, ready to capture whatever he committed. Vess wrote nothing. Rain hit the canvas like gravel. Kay spread her father's chart book flat on the upturned crate that served as her field desk, weighing the corners with survey pins because the driftwood frame shuddered with every gust. The shelter was built for 1. Vess had ducked in behind her when the squall broke over the ridge, and now he stood close enough that his breathing moved the chart's curling edge. She traced the symbol again. 2 concentric circles bisected by a vertical line inked in her father's octopus gall at Station 3. Station 4, Station 6, each paired with a short number sequence that refused to resolve into coordinates elevation, bearing, or tide. What's the survey interval? Vess asked, not the symbol, the methodology, every season. She kept her finger on the ink. Same stations, same order, alone. How many years? 11 that I know of, probably longer. She turned the page. Station 4's symbol was darker, pressed harder into the paper. Her father had gone over it twice, obsessively. The word came out carrying more weight than she'd intended. She didn't take it back. Vess shifted behind her. His chest almost touched her shoulder. He didn't step away. When did he stop? Rain filled the shelter. Water beaded on the canvas above them, tracking sideways in the wind, finding the seams. A drop hit the chart's margin and she blotted it with her sleeve before it could reach the ink. He didn't stop, she said. He died. Vess went still. Not the stillness of surprise. She'd learned the difference across 3 evenings. This was the stillness of recalculation, the same arrested quality she'd seen when she first showed him the Eastern escarpment figures. A man deciding what to keep behind his teeth. Your calibration marks. His voice carefully leveled. The southern stations. Did he reset the pins each season or use fixed benchmarks? She let him redirect. The way she'd let him redirect when he saw the surname on her chart header, the way she'd let him redirect when the substrate data matched the Bureau's own suppressed memo. The shelter was very small. Neither of them moved to make it larger. The document sat between a tide chart and a provision list. Kai saw it the way she saw coastal fractures. The thing that didn't belong, instantly legible in its wrongness. Hershey watermark, diplomatic seal, no signature. She picked it up and read it standing, her field boots still tracking mud across her mother's kitchen floor. Resettlement on 3 Hershey client islands. 3. Population distributed by labor classification. Fishers to 1, terrace workers to another, skilled trades to a 3rd. Moran governance dissolved upon departure. Cultural preservation allowances, line item present, amount blank. The page smelled like candle wax and old bread. Lyra stood at the counter with her back to Kay, hands flat on the wood, not turning. How long have you had this? 6 weeks. The rain had stopped. Kay could hear water running off the eaves into the clay cistern, each drop countable. Before you commissioned my survey. Lyra turned then, not with guilt, with preparation. She crossed to the table and laid a second sheet beside the relocation terms. Columns in her mother's hand, the same tight script Kay remembered from household ledgers. But these columns counted people. Lives lost per month of delayed evacuation, indexed against Kay's own erosion figures, extrapolated forward. 14 in the first season, 31 in the second. The numbers climbed with the same self-steepening curve Kay had plotted at the Northwestern station and written Y beside. Your survey gives us leverage to negotiate better terms. Lyra's voice was steady as basalt. That's why I commissioned it. Kay stared at her mother's handwriting, the precision of it, the ruled margins, each death accounted for with the same care Kay used to mark vanishing meters of coastline. The same skill, the same instruments turned toward surrender instead of proof. She gathered the papers from the table, rolled them tight, walked to the door. Kay? She didn't stop. The door stayed open behind her, salt air flooding the kitchen, and Lyra didn't close it. Kay crossed the square with the document against her ribs. No lamp in the windows facing the harbor. One light in Vess's room, steady behind shutters. She didn't knock, pushed the door with her shoulder and set the relocation terms on his desk beside the bureau template he still hadn't filled. He read standing. She watched his eyes track the clauses. Population distributed across 3 client islands. Governance dissolved upon departure. Cultural provisions left as a blank line. And his face did nothing. Not the careful nothing of diplomatic composure. The nothing of recognition. He turned the page as though he already knew what the second paragraph contained. You've seen this before. Not this document. This structure. He set the page down, aligned its edge with the template's edge, a gesture so automatic it condemned him. Is this what your bureau does? She kept her voice level, professional, the register of a surveyor presenting findings. Distribute populations across client islands and dissolve local governance? He answered with a number. 73% of assessed islands in the past 8 years have accepted terms with this architecture, some negotiated margins, housing allocations, labor placement tiers. The frame doesn't change. The fish oil lamp guttered. His shadow moved on the wall and settled. What happened to the ones that refused? The pause was real. She'd learned to read him. The performative silences, the tactical redirections to methodology, the careful non-answers that moved like Hershey trade vessels through channels they'd already mapped. This pause had none of that architecture. His hand rested on the desk between the 2 documents, the terms her mother had hidden for 6 weeks and the template he'd been unable to fill for 3 days. They're still being assessed. The sentence opened like a cavity beneath a cliff face. Solid surface, nothing underneath. She picked up the relocation terms. His fingers stayed where they were. The space between their hands held the shape of everything neither of them had said, and this time the gap did not close. The numbers hadn't changed. Lyra set down the stylus and pressed her knuckles against the table edge until the wood bit back. Kay's actuarial projections lay where she'd left them, not thrown, not crumpled, just abandoned beside the provision lists and the tide chart and the clay bread crock that had hidden the relocation terms for 6 weeks. Abandoned with the precision of a woman who wanted her mother to sit with them alone. She sat with them. The oil lamp guttered. Lyra pulled the correspondence file from beneath the loose board under her chair. 3 months of letters, 11 exchanges, each one a small amputation performed in formal Maran prose. She had written the first letter the night after her midnight calculation confirmed the eastern and southern profiles. I write on behalf of the Council of Mara to inquire regarding terms of structured resettlement. She had not written on behalf of the Council. She had written on behalf of her own arithmetic and the 612 people it condemned. The liaison's replies were clipped. Hershey, transactional shorthand. No greeting, no closing, no name she could verify against a living face. The most recent sat on top. Terms are preliminary. Adjustments contingent on assessor's viability determination. Everything she had built, the careful scaffolding of a retreat that preserved some fragment of Maran dignity, hung on the number Vess Huron would write into his bureau template, and her daughter was spending evenings in a canvas shelter with the man who held the pen. Lyra closed the file. Reached for the composite chart Kay had left behind in the walkout. She traced the exponential curve with her fingertip, feeling the slight ridge where Kay had pressed too hard with the stylus at the inflection point. The math was her daughter's. Meticulous, furious, correct. The conclusion was hers. They agreed on the data. They disagreed on what the data permitted. She smoothed the chart flat, weighting the corners with the same clay cups she'd used over her husband's charts. Then she noticed what Kay had written in the margin beside the acceleration curve, small and steady in her surveyor's hand. Who asked them to come? The cliff edge had moved. Kay drove the iron pin where her last reading had been 5 days ago, and felt it sink through basalt like a finger through wet ash. She reset it 2 handspans back, stretched the chain to her father's reference cairn, 3 stones left of 4, and measured. 19 centimeters gone. She measured again. 19. She needed this. The chain's tension, the pin's bite, the number's refusal to lie. After last night, the instruments were the only language that hadn't betrayed her. She crouched over her father's chart book open to the northwestern station. The symbol was here too. 2 concentric circles bisected by a vertical line. She'd copied each instance into her own margins without reading them as a sequence. Now she did. The paired numbers descended. 41, 36, 29. Each station lower than the last, the intervals uneven, but the direction absolute. Not elevation, she'd checked, not distance. He'd been tracking something draining out of the ground beneath him, and he'd watched it drop like water leaving a basin. Below, at the tideline deck, one of the island's last working fishermen was crouched among the exposed rocks with a younger man, both palms pressed flat against a sea-wet boulder. The younger one yanked his hand back and shook it hard, flexing his fingers. Dak kept his down. He looked up at Kay on the cliff. "You feel it too, yeah? In the ground?" She opened her mouth. He'd already turned back to the stone, his voice carried upward by the updraft. Not whispered, not hidden, just spoken at the volume of a thing too old to shout. My grandmother sang it. Songs about the land knitting itself whole, bone finding bone under the water. She said you could feel it when the knitting stopped. The younger fisherman patted his shoulder and looked out at the horizon. Currents change, Dak. That's all it is. Dak wiped his palm on his trousers as though the stone had left something on his skin. He didn't argue. Kay looked down at her father's descending numbers and felt the question form before she could stop it. What, exactly, had stopped? Rain hit the canvas like thrown gravel. Kay had pinned the charts side by side, her father's stations on the left, hers on the right, the descending annotations circled in red ink she'd borrowed from the council clerk's kit. 41, 38, 34, 29, 23, each number smaller, each symbol identical, 2 concentric circles, the vertical line bisecting them like a blade through a pupil. She traced the sequence with her fingertip, not explaining, not narrating, working. The performance had stopped somewhere around the 3rd evening and she hadn't bothered to restart it. Vess sat at the makeshift desk with his bureau template and the carbon sheet, both still blank. He watched her hand move station to station. She muttered without turning, "He was measuring something that isn't elevation." He set down his pen, crossed to the wall, stopped 1 step short of where she stood. Close enough that she could feel the heat off his rain-damp sleeve, far enough that neither of them had to name the distance. He tilted his head, his eyes tracked left to right across the symbol at Station 3, Station 4, Station 6, and then... He stopped. Something moved behind his face. Fast. Controlled. The kind of stillness she'd learned to read across 5 evenings. Not the absence of reaction, but its active suppression. The same quality she'd catalogued when he first saw her surname on the chart header. When the substrate data matched his bureau memo, the pattern was his tell and he didn't know she'd learned it. I don't recognize the notation. The sentence landed flat, complete. No trailing methodology, no redirect to calibration margins or instrument tolerances, just the wall of 5 words and nothing behind them. She turned. The space between them smelled like wet canvas and lamp oil and the salt that got into everything on this island. His jaw was set. Her charts dripped condensation onto the packed earth floor. "You paused," she said. "I was reading." The rain thickened. Neither of them was looking at the charts anymore. Torith's fist hit the basalt table before the doors finished closing. "The harbor master knows." His voice carried the particular tremor of a large man holding himself smaller than his fury. The dock workers know. The fish gutters on the morning shift know. Half the quay heard it from a Hershey deckhand before I heard it from my own counsel. 6 chairs, 5 occupied. The harbor delegate's seat empty again, and now the absence read like desertion. Lyra stood at the table's head, hands flat on the stone, feeling the faint vibration she'd learned to ignore. I opened a channel, she said. 3 months ago. 11 letters. My name, not the council's. Sarah leaned forward. Without mandate. Negotiation requires the council's vote. I brought you options, not decisions. The distinction landed and died. Peller, the youngest, stared at the table's surface as though he could see through it to the harbor below. Toroth's jaw worked once, twice. Then he reached across the stone and picked up the document Lyra had placed there. The same page he'd pushed back with 2 fingers the session before. The Hershey watermark he'd refused to read. He read it now. Population distributed across 3 client islands. His voice flattened to recitation. Varro, Tessic, Hirsch's Western Settlement Corridor. Each name a place no one at the table had visited. Local governance structures to be dissolved upon completion of departure. He paused on the next line. Cultural preservation provisions. He held the page closer to the lamp. It's blank, Lyra. The line is blank. The room contracted. Not anger. Something older, something Moran. Every breath pulled inward and held behind teeth. The communal withdrawal that preceded judgment without words. Lyra did not sit. She stood in the center of that silence with her hands still flat on the basalt, feeling the island's tremor through her palms, waiting for the room to decide whether she was a traitor or the only one who'd had the courage to count the dead before they died. No one spoke. The blank line hung in the lamplight like a door left open onto nothing. Kay let her legs hang over the edge. The cliff dropped 40 meters to foam and basalt teeth. Her charts lay across her thighs, weighted with her father's plumb bob, the lead pendulum swinging slightly in the updraft. The council chamber's silence had followed her here, or she'd carried it the way Marans carry everything, close and unshared. Below, the surf gnawed at rock that used to be beach. She heard his boots on the gravel path before he reached her. 2 steps behind. He stopped there. My mother has been negotiating our end for 6 weeks. She didn't turn. The wind took her voice south toward the headlands where her father's stations were disappearing one by one. And your bureau sent you here to certify it. Vess said nothing. The silence between them had a different texture than the council's. Not communal withdrawal, but individual calculation. 2 people measuring the same gap from opposite sides. She listened to him not deny it. The surf filled the space where his defense should have been. What does your report say? I haven't submitted it. She turned. The wind caught her hair and dragged it across the open chart, across the acceleration curve, across the marginal Y she'd written 6 days ago, across her father's descending count that neither of them had explained and neither had stopped thinking about. Vess stood with his hands at his sides, no transit case, no bureau template, just a man on a cliff edge who had carried numbers for 4 dead islands and was holding the 5ths in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. His face was stripped of the professional architecture she'd spent 5 evenings learning to read. What was underneath looked like exhaustion. It looked like the thing before a decision. Then it still matters what you write. The sentence hung. Statement. Question. Something that lived in the space where his body was 2 steps from hers and neither of them closed it or named it. Below, a section of cliff face the width of a door frame calved into the sea without sound. Just a dark shape falling, then white water, then nothing where land had been.
On her map, a story from the Saltscar universe. Written by Julia L. Vale, produced by Muck Neon. New chapters every Saturday. Follow the Saltscar social accounts for daily reels.